Hello, respected viewers. So, welcome back to my channel. Well, they're lugubrious tidings. It is a day of infamy that Putin really has plumbed the depths of absolute depravity in bombing a children's hospital, including a maternity ward. I don't know how many people have been killed. Now, this could be cock up rather than conspiracy. Was it just sheer incompetence rather than absolute malice? But this sort of thing has happened again and again and again. The purposeful targeting of civilians, low down dastardly tricks, declaring a truce in various besieged cities, persuading civilians to come out of their bomb shelters onto the streets and then shelling them, persuading some civilians that get safe passage to come onto a road, which the Russians had mined, and on and on and on. And there's really nothing that Putin won't sink to. And perhaps I shouldn't personalize. It's not just about one man. I want to say Putin rather than Russia. I don't want to be besmirching the reputation of all Russians or even the Russian army to suggest they're all wicked. I mean, that wouldn't be fair. The good and bad people in every nationality, and I'm sure that many Russians are just as sickened as I am by this kind of thing. So it really is particularly repugnant. What an abhorrent thing to do, but you can bet your bottom dollar the Russian public will not be allowed to find out about this, that it didn't happen, or that the Ukrainians did it to themselves, or something like that, or that Ukrainians have done this to Russians, because Russians are getting a very different idea of this, that they're greeted by people who are delighted, who are jubilant, feel that they're saviors, and from Russians have been captured, you see what happened. I mean, they said it was a training exercise. It went on rather a long time. Then when the war begins, they're told, well, it'll be a cakewalk, which I think the Russian high command believed, and they thought that they would be greeted with delight, they would be garlanded, and their way would be carpeted with flowers. Well, it was no bed of roses, and they met very stiff resistance. But that's why they didn't have enough food or fuel or anything like that. And other things we find out about this Russia's war machine is it's really not well oiled. Is that they have all this military hardware, but equipment is no substitute for competence or effort, and they take all the gear and no idea, and just not done some of the fundamental tasks of keeping their vehicles in a decent state of repair. I met a Korean guy who served with the US military and said, well, in the motor pool, we had to inspect and mend the vehicles every single day. They had to be in a roadworthy condition. And obviously the Russian army has just not performed some of the really basic tasks. Now, Russian military hardware, and I don't know much about this, I'm getting from military people, is it's only serviceable. It's never a state of the art. And it's at the lower end of the price range. But Russia's got the third highest military budget in the world, $150 billion. That's almost half the budget. It was only 25% in the Soviet era. It's now like 45% of their budget. And that's why Russians live in poverty. And in the 2018 election, Putin made this a central plank of his re-election campaign, that the Russian armed forces are the mightiest in the world. Well, look how false that is. And I know that on paper, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 4-1. But then again, the Russians have only got about a quarter of their army there. And because they can't supply the ones they've got, the 200,000 odd, far less the rest of them. I'm surprised the Ukrainians aren't doing more about this, aren't even crossing the border into Belarus and Ukraine, and Russia, and blowing up bridges and railways and stuff like that to prevent resupply. And NATO is obviously supplying the Ukrainians, but from the border of Romania and Poland, how do they get things to Kiev and beyond? Cars? I mean, I know there are any functioning petrol stations. You'd eventually run out of petrol. Getting things to Kharkiv, I just don't know how you do it, but driving in civilian cars. There was a successful evacuation from one of the eastern cities, 700 Indian students. I'm guessing that's because of behind-the-scenes diplomatic pressure from India to get the students out of Sumy. Remember, India abstained in the United Nations Security Council vote. So Russia will be grateful for that. But anyway, Zelensky, he addressed the British Parliament on Zoom, the only person in history ever to be able to address the Parliament remotely, and it shows on what high regard he is held. And he says that, you know, millions of people will die if a firm stand isn't taken. And it's true that really Putin's his lust for conquest, his expansionism knows no bounds, because he said to NATO, you have to pull back to where you were in 1997. So leave Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Montenegro, Albania, how many more of them were relatively undefended, vulnerable to being subjugated by him? He wants salami tactics. That's his done Ukraine, taking a thin slice and a thin slice. The world scarcely notices, doesn't cares. But he's taking more and more and more until it's too late. That's the way he operates. Anyway, so Zelensky's appealing for this no-fly zone, but NATO countries said we can't do that because then we have to enforce it, which means shooting down Russian jets, which means possibly the Third World War. And even if the entire population of Ukraine is wiped out, that's not as bad as the whole of the Homo sapiens sapiens being annihilated in the Third World War. My goodness. So it's very worrying. But it's a pity that the United States says, no, we won't facilitate Poland giving its MiG jets to Ukraine, because the Ukrainians could fly this without any additional training because they use those MiG jets anyway. I don't know why the Poles don't hand them over directly. What's this got to do with the United States? Because that would bolster the Ukrainian Air Force a lot. And actually, they're still flying, and that's another surprising thing, is the Russians haven't used their Air Force that much, considering they don't have total air superiority. And the other thing is the Ukrainians holding back, not really hammering that column north of Kiev. You think they throw everything they have on that, break the siege of Kiev. It's a sitting duck. This golden opportunity is not going to return. You could wreak very heavy losses on them. So the United States estimates up to 10% of Russian assets in Ukraine have been destroyed already, like, fuel tankers, artillery, tanks and so on, armored personnel carriers, other trucks. So Russia can replace this, but they're only 2 weeks into the war. If it goes on for 20 weeks, all of those will be destroyed. No doubt they'll be able to bring in more, they can manufacture more, they can purchase more, but the cost is going to go higher and higher and higher. Can Ukraine eventually convince Russia that the cost of fighting on is just too high, it's just not worth it? To begin with, Putin doesn't seem to care, he's really going to wreck his economy, and soon people aren't going to be paid on time. The people he considers least important, like those who sweep the streets, they're not going to be paid on time. Nurses, eventually teachers, finally doctors, the police. In the 1990s, the only people who got paid on time were nuclear weapons troops and the Secret Service, KGB, SVR. Ordinary soldiers didn't get paid for months, and I didn't even get fed. We'll be back to that. The bad old days, as recently as 2006, people, the police in Russia would sometimes shake you down, even if you hadn't done anything wrong, demand a bribe, because that was how they had to survive. They paid so little, or sometimes just not paid at all for months. They consider it their right to extort bribes. If you'd done something wrong, you might accept it as a fine, but when you hadn't done anything wrong at all, they used to say, there was one phrase in English that every Russian policeman knew, 50 bucks. Anyway, so it's really not looking good. I'm surprised that there have not been more casualties on either side, really, because I don't quite believe the Ukrainian figures probably too optimistic, and the Russian ones just lying, really underestimating the losses they've suffered. Anyway, over 16,000 foreigners have volunteered to go to fight for Ukraine. Not that many of them arrived. I mean, some of them got no military experience whatsoever. So there have been protests in Kherson, 400 people detained, and obviously the Russian army saying, well, they can shoot people dead for protesting. Wouldn't surprise me one whit. There are mass protests in Russia because of and the anti-war sentiment, then I'm sure Putin will not hesitate to have them shot dead. He very much approved of when that happened in Tiananmen Square. He's very much approved of when his fellow tyrants in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan have done likewise. So there we go. It's a dispiriting situation. So Putin cannot be allowed to get away with this. I'm slightly worried that he will somewhat, or be some sort of compromise, which may think that the West is vacillating, is weak-willed, is feebled, and just won't back Ukraine to the hilt. So there we go. I'm very glad not to be there. And nothing I've said is remotely Russophobic. No nationality is bad. It's an awful pity. Though the Russian public knew the truth, they would be revolted too. And some of them are. So it takes a lot of moral courage to recognise your government is doing something utterly wicked. That's enough for me. Toodle pip.